the mounted reserve under the command of the Gascon leader, the Captal de Buch, to carry out a flank attack, right, with part of these men, right? So what was actually done was not seemingly transforming the remaining English forces, like the bulk of them numerically, in a mounted unit. I think this may have been done as well. I haven't found a reference to this, but the most important thing now, given that everybody was exhausted, as we've seen during the attack of the Dauphin, Edward had to send troops himself from his own division, right? So to support to support Warwick and Oxford on the right, and we don't know the measures of this, so we don't know whether the prince's division was also partly mounted during the following attack, and the Captal de Buch in parallel attacked with these mounted troops. Also, we don't know how many there were. There may have been like 100 men at arms or more. So the idea is that there may have been a distribution of cavalry both in the main force and in this small one. The flank attack in military history, as we were saying before, especially in the centuries before Poitiers, had been a bit of a standard thing in the main pitched battles. This battle was, as we've seen, not so obviously, let's say, in fact, dynamic, as it was a positioned battle in some way, like a pitched one. But definitely the English that had the advantage of terrain could use the Maupertuis hill to essentially outflank the French through this small contingents that was just, again, contained in numbers. It didn't need to be big, right? Even in pitched battles, you don't have entire battle lines that are hidden somewhere. First of all, because it's more difficult to hide them, and you need them kind of more concentrated on the enemy as it advances. What the concealed reserve really does is creating a shock, right, psychologically, because you think you're surrounded, you don't know what's going on, and you are attacked on the flank, so in a part that you cannot fight functionally in, because the men are distributed very specifically within a unit. You can't simply change front and thinking that the unit works in the same way, because men are trained to follow the ones, certain particular ones in the front. They occupy different space in front and in depth. So you're caught between two fires, and you have a main force pushing from the front, and then another one that can cut through your lines. Again, for whoever knows, especially 13th century warfare, that's a very common tactic, also in the early 14th century. In the mid-14th, we see less of this, arguably, at least on a larger scale, because pitched battles of this properly decrease in frequency, and they're also smaller than the ones of the previous centuries. But you still find them, and Poitiers, in fact, is a good example of that. And this would be factually arranged, right? In insight, there was probably no way to synchronize the attack of the French, because even if the English would have counterattacked, definitely this would have happened still by awaiting for the enemy, right? Not abandoning their own position for at least for long, because it would have simply separated them from their safe zone, and in a sense they would have also lost more cohesion, etc. Naturally the reserve of the Captain the Buch had greater autonomy tactically, because it was smaller, it was more difficult to spot also by the enemy. So it was them who had rather to synchronize the attack of the two bigger to the enemy during the clash of the bigger units, right? So that's how it normally happened. You hinged, you blocked the enemy, you pinned the enemy in the main engagement, then you attacked him from the flank, from the rear. And timing was everything, because clashes were very confused, and you at least probably not so much in the way we're usually told, but things can go wrong quickly, right? Both for you, for others. You may just imagine this reserve. I mean, going out there, they knew that the main French army, hopefully, wasn't behind the hill, carrying out an encircling maneuver themselves. We don't know. Maybe the French thought about doing certain things. It's rare to find a battle when you're told that a flank attack was carried out successfully and there was an enemy flanking in the same fashion. And the reason being that maybe it's just because that attack was successful and the others were not worth being mentioned, because who knows how many smaller units floated around also from the spent lines and so on during the battle. In fact, it should be pointed out that also the fact that the French were dismounted largely facilitated the superimposition even of different battles, right? That's in partly why John may have been criticized, because cavalry charge requires properly open ground. You don't have to have anyone in between. On foot, you don't have to lose the cohesion of your own division, but let's say we find in the accounts here this may be an accident or also because chroniclers say different things, but you find certain noblemen that are still kind of are told to have still been in an attack while the second, let's say the posterior lines were coming in. So it may be, yes, the single companies would be around or something like that. So that's why the whole thing was so risky. Sometimes it's just plainly a mistake. For example, the Walter of Brienne that we knew died in the battle, but there are two chronicles saying first one died together with Clermont during the first one, then another says that when the Dauphin attacked, Brienne was still there. So we can't reconstruct that. Like if I don't know if you have ever reconstructed from a battle from this kind of sources. Like you don't. First of all, it's not that they don't say things right because they're lying. First of all, they may be wrong, but especially it's how the battle is explained. I mean, the sequence, etc., that is vague, and so you don't understand what they're even talking about precisely. It's very difficult to find. Okay, I have 20 accounts. They all fit the same narrative. They're always differing, but it doesn't mean that there is a core from which eventually the battle can be reconstructed. In any case, we are sure that this fight took place. We don't know too much of the details of this last clash, except that both sides fought stoutly, that the issue was long in doubt, that the mounted archers, having exhausted their projectiles, joined in the hand-to-hand conflict with their swords, which is something that by the mid-14th century also kind of light infantry can do. I mean, they can't always do in any age, but say at this point troops began to be a bit more qualitative also in the lighter element, because properly the throwaway ones, as we've seen, disappeared from the battlefield, and that's why armies were kind of smaller. So they're lighter compared to heavier troops, but they still can engage functionally by some degree into hand-to-hand fighting. We know that the capital attacked the left flank and rear of the French battle, and that this had an important effect, right? Sources never tell you, see, this battle was won because this guy attacked from the flank. It's obvious that if there hadn't been, the Prince of Wales with the rest of the English army engaging the French, the capital may have even attacked from the rear. The flank would have not obtained a good nothing. 100 men against 6,000 or something like that, at least 6,000 is a big term, as I said before, probably there were less. And this epic attack, in fact, of the Prince of Wales must have been really a sight, right? To just those things that you would have liked to be there with a video camera and say, okay, like, let's film this, or how it was. Like, so the English men-at-arms mounted on their horses. There was some memory to that because, for example, at the Battle of Halidon Hill 23 years before, this was also the case, right? And so the English at this point, that we don't know exactly where the charge happened, but some say that it was that the Prince of Wales had moved his men on the hill of Maupertuis to essentially exploit the altitude, so charging downhill upon the division of dismounted men-at-arms of the King of France. So if he managed to score that, because that would have also kind of elevated would have brought his forces inside, so the French may have arranged themselves accordingly. So it's not necessarily that they would have, for example, not stopped to try to counter the English cavalry charge, right? But remember that the English also were habituated to engage against, to stop French cavalry charges in some way, even though just with adequate terrain. And this may have been the thing that the French were attacking in open terrain against a charging cavalry, and that is not a tactically favorable situation. Naturally, there were lots of other troops that were dismounted, probably the majority, right? Even including some men-at-arms, likely, because we don't know that specifically. But evidently, everybody who would, right? And others would just also be there. Think about the wounded or people with broken arms or legs or things. They would have probably be there. At least maybe not all of them, of course, especially if you have a broken leg, but at least to show up, right? To make mass, to maybe not even being involved in the hand-to-hand fighting. I mean, usually posterior ranks also could see non-combatants to show off, like saying, look, there are more people, and this psychologically is intimidating. But the important thing was the cavalry charge. Here you have mounted men-at-arms that finally, even though they are spent from foot fighting, they can't let their horses do a lot, and in that last attack they would be dramatically spirited, like saying, let's do this, it's the most epic thing ever. And literally I can't think of a similar engagement. Like, Poitiers is amazing as a battle. I didn't know that. I admit I didn't study it in detail. I had kind of an idea of what had happened, but not especially of this last exploit. It's fantastic. And in fact, we don't know even what happened later much. Like, we can also conjecture a little bit these details and so on. What we know is that the French Royal Division was routed, right? Except for a few men, and this always happens in every battle, basically. There is a pocket of men that always exists, in part because they allow others to retreat more safely, buy time for them, but because they literally have to defend their honor. And that's where King John, also his son Philip, fight to the last until they're captured, right? In the mass, by the way, the King of France was surrounded by other, I think, like something like 15 men, all dressed up like him, so not to make it too easy for the English to target the king. But evidently this was, I mean, if you arrived to those men, you already knew that you had gotten to the cream, and the king was there. As we've seen, the French royals weren't shy to get dirt in blood. As we've seen, the Dauphin had fought valiantly, his brother, to his father as well. And John surrendered to a a knight from Artois that was, however, fighting for the English, because he said I had forfeited everything to them, or my possessions. And John said, I want Edward. I want to surrender to the Prince of Wales. I want to surrender to my cousin. And this guy said, I can't do that for you, but if you surrender to me, I will bring you to him. This is a bit more of many chivalric examples, and so at that point, the King of France decided to surrender, which, again, there is no, I mean, definitely no person today can claim anything against this choice, individually as a person, because definitely the king showed to have that consistent mind solidity to know how to handle a situation like that after all. And that's what we underestimate about people in the past, their megalopsyche, probably in the amount of moral forces and how much of a pressure they were habituated to sustain in such an unstable world like that one. And that's what they were like this, and they were trained, they were educated to behave like this. So this is literally how it went, right? We have information about the route, the pursuit. We know even some incidents in which there is, for example, a French knight that was fleeing on foot, and he was chased by an English knight on horseback, and the English knight at a distance said, surrender, and the French said nuts, and the English charged, but the French was able to parry or to avoid the hit, and actually the English one fell, and it was the French one who actually, with others, I suppose, managed to take prisoner this English guy, even though the English had won the battle. And this happens in pursuits, like especially if you pursue too far. And in fact, that was also kind of a critical moment, because the battle ended literally, as we've seen, probably towards noon, but there were things going on, and simply the Black Prince set up his tent on the top of the Maupertuis hill, and that's where the English stayed, fundamentally, to claim, as you know, also the fact that for days nobody would claim that contest the control of the field. That was the formal way of saying that you had won a battle, right? It was risky, because as we've seen, they wouldn't know still whether there were other French around, and they were probably quite anxious about that, because considering how things had gone first, they would remember. But it was evident at that point that the French had been routed, and especially lots of them were captured in the entire process, and that would be the measure also of the victory. Regarding the numbers, we don't have the losses, etc. We don't have such a huge certainty, more than we have for the broader size of the armies, right? Sources speak, but we actually have the same account of the Black Prince, which is quite meaningful, about, I think, something like 2,100 captured French, which also may account for the ones that were actually just worth a ransom. Other sources say more. Naturally, there were the dead as well. There were not as many as the prisoners, likely, or maybe similarly to them, but most people were just captured later on, or killed after, during that same pursuit. So, as far as the combat is concerned, it's different. People say just, a few English men-at-arms died, and among the commoners there were maybe 40, 50 dead. Think something in terms of, maybe a few hundreds of men-at-arms died, and maybe more hundreds among the commoners died, also from the English side, at least, right? So the losses were not so few from the English side as well, but it is true that, of course, the moment of the clash is not so bloody as the one of the pursuit. So we don't have so many numbers about that. The French lost probably a good half of their entire force, either killed or captured, and this was a disaster, because the king was captured. Some of the highest noblemen, for example, the Duke of Bourbon was captured. As we've seen, the Saint Philip, son of the king, and lots of other French noblemen, and really big shots, right? And in fact, they were handsomely ransomed. Telling you the truth, there was a lot of chivalry involved in this all, because it seems that most of the French were literally left free the same day, probably because the English were too few to guard them, and secondly because they could have been killed otherwise, but they would have been a burden of some sort. They didn't have the means to prevent their escape, so they made them swear, naturally in front of everyone, so with that degree of public validity and legal validity, that they were prisoners on parole. And in fact, most of them presumably would ransom themselves later on parole. This tells you how important the deeds of a person were, even in such a relatively modernized and secularized late medieval reality, because the idea, the death of chivalry and so on, but it was important that among all those people, like English, French, all people that knew each other, kind of, especially among the nobility, even across the channel and so on, to say, well, that guy I remember sat in front of all of us at such a big battle like Poitiers that everybody would have remembered. I was taken prisoner, and I swear I will go away, but I will pay you back for my freedom. It was a huge thing. Like, the honor involved in that was internationally, for the political and social connections of these people, enormous. And so that's also how largely the English benefited from this. I don't think there is really much more to add to this. Like, we have a good certainty the battle was fought where it was fought. We found Edward III's coins exactly where we think the English set up camp, and there was a greater, like, the battlefield. I haven't visited it, telling you the truth. I've been to France so many times, but never gone there. But it's probably worthwhile. I mean, probably there is nothing that interests, aside from natural beauty, maybe the amateur just would, says, okay, yeah, it's been fought here, but I can't see much more. Like, but it's definitely, if you know how the battle has gone, how we think it has gone, definitely you can, with a map, with some accounts, visit the battlefield. And I tell you that visiting the battlefields of a battle that you actually studied is a life-changing experience. I had the privilege of doing this. It was just like a pilgrimage to me. And I understood that battle. Doesn't matter that I studied it for 1 year in a row, but I until I stepped on the battlefield, I wouldn't know exactly how that battle went. And I mean it, because the terrain is everything, really. In the you can't understand certain things until you step there. So medieval warfare definitely doesn't get down to me speaking for a couple of hours about this battle without even reading the single accounts and so on. So again, as I was saying before, we can't do that. But I think it's worth reflecting on the value of this battle for what it is. Like, when you hear, for example, of the importance of the longbow, how important was the longbow in this battle? Like, how much did we talk about it? And how much more do we know about the English, by the way, compared to the French? Let's say the crossbowmen and all. How important are combined arms? How important is terrain choice? How important is morale and leadership, and order and luck, frankly? These are the things that really matter. Like, you can't, like, if you want to skip the entire video and arrive to this point and say, okay, what do you take from Poitiers? Well, aside from what we explain in terms of sheer fulfillment, basically, of every single tactical possibility from the English side, it definitely speaks a lot about the Black Prince capacities here. It's extraordinary, to say the least, to see a commander maintaining such a cold blood, right, and control and vision and initiative and spirit. It's fantastic, right? This person was really extraordinary. But what I get from it is that this battle seems like, the more I study hundreds years war battles, and the more I realize how they have barely anything to do with how the English or the French were fighting in terms of an alleged preset doctrine or tactic. Like, these were basically the same armies, and they were fighting naturally with some different background and some kind of different habit, but especially, again, this thing also of dismounting troops or having just this fairly compact armies of just 6,000 men. Here we're talking about an English army. It's not the full power of the English kingdom per se, but this is just a smaller battle than most battles that were fought, let's say, in the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century. Right? You would even wonder, like, what... Because there were still larger armies than this. At least, again, yes, Europeans were trying to save more, to be more compact and so on. But it's just 6,000 men. Right? Do you have an idea, for example, in my doctoral thesis, how many 6,000 men armies have been fighting throughout all the early 14th century, even just in single regions, and nobody doesn't even consider them having existed. They barely. The broader, even historiography sometimes, the broader popular culture doesn't even know the major battles of the Middle Ages, including these ones and others that were even actually more important. They hear just about some, and they don't realize that these bigger ones that they arbitrarily select from much bigger, more important ones, even in terms of political outcome and even tactically best, this one is beautiful, by the way. Poitiers is terrifyingly perfect and complete in a sense, especially from the English side. But and unique in this kind. But they ignored that such a battle could have been fought in the same way, let's say by all those 6,000 armies that nobody remembers and that were out there. Even from the French side, as usual, I don't see any specific weakness aside from the big retreat of the Duke of Orléans. That's definitely not a normal thing, but it happened. Like, if you study the battle accounts, it's kind of normal to see, like, at some point this battle didn't attack because, I don't know, they decided to betray or they weren't motivated, whatever. It's not the norm for every battle, but let's say 1 every 3 battles you find it. Like, it's not such a strange thing, and you can hardly place like a structure. Like, sometimes we just don't know why they retreated, right? Because especially when you study these battles in a series, or the battles of certain specific places and all in a row, you realize that these things happen, but they don't seem to have a structural reason whatsoever. Like, they could be political reasons that have nothing to do with this specific power or another. So what normally is done for the 100 Years' War battles is putting a stamp on saying, this is the English army. The one that won at Poitiers is mostly Gascon, by the way, and this one is French. And so it's France and England. This was like this and this was like that, and you crystallize two ideas that have basically no coincidence with reality, no connection with reality, and pretend that throughout all the war, or the wars that the 100 Years' War actually was, they repeated themselves as patterns. And this is not quite the point. I mean, even the French cavalry charges at different times. Here you start seeing immediately, already from Poitiers onward, you see that the French dismount. And they dismount also because the terrain would have made any other cavalry dismount, right? Not because they, I don't know, they had just been defeated at Crécy or at Courtrai or whatever. This is because that's what a competent commander does. Just like a competent commander dismounts from the English side because they're too few and they are receiving a massive onslaught, and they pick a specific, close terrain where they can hope to resist in this dire straits. So in the broader picture, in my opinion, this battle is beautiful because, again, from Edward of Woodstock, you see the maximization of any tactical purpose. So it's a manual of moral force. But as far as the battle was fought, in the bigger lines, aside from, yes, maybe this pattern of the 100 Years' War, that's the massive French against the smaller English and so on, so the terrain exploitation and so on, this battle is pretty anonymous. Right? You can't distinguish it saying, look at what different strategic concept has been put to places at Poitiers. This is essentially how all armies fought. And just the difference was made by those who did it better compared to those who did it worse. And it's the latter would have not even been the case. In fact, the French probably didn't fight badly at all. And so it's the exemption seems to be rather this one struck me, how the English remounted on horse. I mean, decided to fight dismounted, but say having this critical intuition of say, okay, let's attack on horseback in the last attack, and let's hope that flank attack combined with our own will make it. And even that clash seems to have been very closely fought till the end. So it's very inspiring in many ways. It's beautiful to learn and to read of it. Yet at the same time, it's the combination of tactical principles that you find since antiquity. Like it's not a it's not something surprising. And again, where are the longbowmen here? What a prominent role did they play? Probably they did, right? I'm not saying they wouldn't, but let's say maybe crossbowmen in their stead would have done kind of the same thing. It seems to me that the way the terrain, for example, influenced the clash in that sense, even for the same employment of the missile, independently from being longbowmen or not, was far more important. And also this guy seems to have run out of ammo, since especially during the second attack they don't figure substantially, nor let's say in the third one a little bit more, or if I'm not wrong, there is evidence of the fact that from the hill of Maupertuis that there was an important English missile fire against incoming French. But again, that's what missile troops do wherever they are, right? So if the French Royal Division had crossbow, and that's what I would have been doing the same way. And we don't find any source saying, here the longbowmen have been better than the crossbow. They don't give a damn about that. They don't even explain whether they confronted themselves, which would have been normal given the aforementioned flank deployment, as I was telling you, being habitual, like in those moments. So there are many details about this battle if you read the accounts that can provide you with an interesting insight. But they mostly refer, because that's what the sources are interested in, to the participation of this or that nobleman in the fight. what they said to each other, single duels, things like that. Um, but nothing clamorously relevant for the broader interaction of the battle lines. That is the same important thing that the most important thing that you find in the broader explanation. Regarding also the English deployment, I think that Burns' theory is very good. I think the English may have engaged the French even with a continuous line. But given that the English were resisting, right, an onslaught, I think having fresh troops, fresh reserves, and given the fact that the front line they had to cover was relatively contained, they didn't fear probably also to be enveloped from the flanks in that process. I think is plausible, right? I think I want to read it like Burn, but in many ways it's just a matter of personal opinion, right? Even though you see, for example, if you open the Osprey picture of the battlefield, you see that the French army is somewhat squashed against the English formation that is also in fact in line, in that single line that we're saying, as if the French deployment on the right extended almost up to the Meurson River. And I don't think that's very realistic. I mean, even just for the vector of the attack, the fact that there was a marsh in between and so on, like, doesn't seem to make things very logical. I think rather that what you would like to win was the left flank on the higher ground of Maupertuis, which may still be the reason why, for example, in the first attack of the Marshals, Clermont may have caused some greater problem to Warwick and Oxford, and the same reason why, to Salisbury and Suffolk, and the same reason why probably that's the same place that the Prince of Wales reinforced with his own troops during the attack of the Dauphin as well. So that's the sources are too vague to give us precisely the answer, right? There is no maths to it, unfortunately. Naturally, one can study the sources and, again, the terrain especially, and gathering enough data to say, okay, well, analyzing it, over-analyzing. I'm sure if I did it myself, I would probably come up with more interesting thoughts than the ones that I came up with today. But I think, generally speaking, this is the substance of the battle. I mean, there isn't like a broader, you see, hyper-complication. What you really see is just the typical battle lines alternating. That's it. You don't need diversions aside from this small reserve on the flank at the end of the battle, which is also typical. But the bigger chunks, like war is simple, right? It's difficult. It's two different things, right? And for the rest, I would say also the context is pretty fascinating. The battlefield is surely very unique, very characteristic in its own ground. This is a bit the case again for this more almost positional warfare that during the late Middle Ages intertwines more deeply with pitched battles, and I think it's a consequence of what we were saying before. Smaller armies can fit, narrower places. This is the point, and so it's a broader consequence of the entire thing. The French attacked with massive forces. They had one chunk of them getting away from the battle. This both time for the English, there were, we can't say whether there's no way to say that the English were to win forcefully, nor that consequently the French lose forcefully, nor that this battle was mishandled. There's a lot of talk in the historiography saying, the French were so incompetent, they attacked in the same place. Well, but I don't know, what would have you done concretely? I may have thought maybe to use the vanguard, maybe for an outflanking maneuver, but into a territory where you think that the enemy may have set up an ambush as well. well, yes, that could distract forces. After all, if you think about that, the idea of the Prince of Wales being uphill, just next to the Wood of Noyer, by the way, so close to the Guet de l'Homme, in order to get out of there in case even of defeat, and checking the forest, and checking also kind of being able to intervene both on the right flank, that is the only one from which really an attack of an encircling maneuver like your own can come from, and we don't even know the route of the reserve of the capital of the book, but we think it was that same one in reverse against the French. And the actual front line is a pretty good deployment, right? It's an intelligent deployment, and it may have been, again, happened because such a in-depth array would have allowed the English commander to cope with some attacks, which evidently the English were fearing, especially when they were deploying around the Wood of Noyer. Edward addressed the archers, specifically praising them, their professionalism, the fact that they had been fighting a long series of wars and so on, and probably because they feared maybe there was an ambush set up by the French, and they considered the fog of war. What also emerges from this battle is that the two armies were aware of each other, of course, as a presence, but they weren't aware of their own array. They weren't aware of how many other troops were out there, right? And this is the proof. The English thought they had won after the Dauphin retreated. The French were surprised by the flank attack of a concealed reserve. This played importantly in terms of, especially of moral forces, right? And the fact that the English army was about to collapse, there were people that the sources say openly were already beginning to flee. And the way the Black Prince managed to save the day is fantastic, right? So I really liked this battle, and I think that we will be talking about it for sure in the future as well. So given that it's just a tactical analysis, I don't even address the various political, even the strategic consequences, because at the end of the day, there were other expeditions before Bretigny, and so whatever. I will talk about it on another occasion. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.